When you appear poor, everything conspires against you. Machiavelli was right. There is something no one warned you about, something that operates silently beneath every conversation, every handshake, every glance someone throws your way before they have even heard your name. It works faster than logic, it moves quicker than fairness, and it has been shaping the full arc of your life whether you chose to acknowledge it or not. The moment you appear weak, the moment your presence signals scarcity, struggle, or desperation, the world reorganizes itself against you. Not always out of cruelty, not always out of conscious decision, but out of a law so ancient, so embedded in the architecture of human nature, that even the most compassionate person obeys it without realizing they are doing so. Machiavelli understood this. He did not apologize for it. He did not dress it in comfortable language or wrap it in reassuring platitudes designed to protect your feelings at the expense of your future. He looked at the world as it was, not as we wished it to be, and he wrote down what he saw with a precision that still cuts like a blade 5 centuries later. And what he saw was this: perception is power. Appearance is armor. And the man who looks like he has nothing will be treated as though he deserves nothing. Preste muita atenção, because what follows is not motivational content. It is not a collection of feel-good principles engineered to keep you comfortable while your life quietly erodes around you. This is a map, a precise and honest map, of how the social world actually functions. A map most people are never given, because those who hold it prefer that you remain lost. If you have ever wondered why certain people seem to move through the world with ease, while you struggle against invisible resistance, the answer lives in what you are about to hear. If you have ever felt overlooked, underestimated, dismissed, not because of your ability, not because of your character or your intelligence or your work ethic, but simply because of how you projected yourself into the room, then this is the moment that changes something. Not tomorrow, not when conditions are more favorable. Now, in this space, with these words. Because the change that is coming is not circumstantial. It does not depend on your salary, your education, your network, or the city you live in. It depends only on one thing: whether you are willing to understand the mechanism that has been governing your social reality without your consent. You already know, somewhere beneath the stories you tell yourself to get through the day, that the world does not treat everyone equally. You have witnessed it, you have felt it. The man in the expensive suit who gets seated faster at the restaurant even when he arrived after you. The woman who carries herself with quiet, unforced certainty and somehow commands the attention of an entire room without raising her voice or making a single calculated move. The colleague who contributes visibly less than you, who generates fewer results, who brings a fraction of your depth to the work, and yet earns disproportionate respect, is consulted first, is positioned better, gets advanced more readily. You have seen these things and perhaps told yourself it was luck or privilege, or some unfair advantage embedded in circumstances you could never access. But that is not the full truth. The full truth is more dangerous than luck. It is more actionable than privilege, and it is far more useful than any complaint about the unfairness of the mechanism could ever be. What separates those people from the ones who go unnoticed, undervalued, and consistently passed over is not luck. It is the mastery of something Machiavelli called the art of appearing, not pretending, not lying, not building an elaborate fiction about who you are. Appearing, projecting an image so aligned with strength, competence, and abundance that the world has no rational alternative but to respond to you accordingly. The distinction between pretending and appearing is not semantic. It is the difference between a mask and a posture. A mask is external and can fall. A posture is a restructuring of how you actually inhabit your existence, and once genuinely internalized, it does not fall. It becomes the thing itself. The appearance of power, when practiced with sufficient consistency and rooted in a real reconstruction of self-perception, stops being appearance and becomes reality. This is not a paradox. This is how all deep transformation works. You do not wait to feel different before you act differently. You act differently until the acting becomes the feeling. Consider what happens in the first 3 seconds when someone encounters you, before you have spoken a word, before you have demonstrated intelligence, competence, warmth, or any of the qualities you have spent years developing. In those 3 seconds, 3 seconds that you are almost certainly not managing consciously, every person who encounters you makes a calculation. It is not rational. It does not consider your history, your capability, or the genuine substance of who you are. It is not kind, but it is relentless, and it is universal. In those 3 seconds, the person in front of you scans your posture, your clothing, the rhythm and intention of your movements, the quality of your stillness when you are not moving, the confidence or anxiety embedded in your facial expression, the way you claim or decline the space immediately around you. And from all of these signals, gathered simultaneously, processed unconsciously, filed with extraordinary speed, they assign you a value. They place you in a hierarchy. They decide, without deliberation and without appeal, whether you are someone to be taken seriously or someone to be managed, tolerated, pitied, or simply ignored. And here is the brutal truth that most people spend a lifetime refusing to accept. Once that calculation is made, it is extraordinarily difficult to change. You will spend hours, weeks, months, years trying to prove yourself to someone who decided in 3 seconds that you were not worth their full attention. You will demonstrate your competence repeatedly to a person whose assessment of your competence was fixed before you opened your mouth. You will build evidence of your value in an environment whose evaluation of your value was completed at the threshold. That is the cost of appearing poor. Not just financially poor, though that is part of it, and we will examine it specifically, but poor in presence, poor in projection, poor in the signal of authority and self-possession that tells the social organism around you how to orient itself in relation to you. That tax, the tax levied by the world on those who project weakness, scarcity, and uncertainty, is the most expensive tax you will ever pay. And unlike financial taxes, it is paid not once a year, but in every interaction. Every room, every conversation, every opportunity that passes to someone whose substance may be less than yours, but whose signal is stronger. Machiavelli did not write about this phenomenon in abstract or theoretical terms. He observed it directly, with his own eyes, in the courts and councils and political chambers of Renaissance Italy, where the stakes of appearing weak were not professional inconvenience, but violent dispossession and death. He watched princes rise and fall, not because of their military capability alone, not because of their intelligence or their genuine qualities of leadership, but because of the image they projected and the consistency with which they projected it. A prince who appeared uncertain invited the challenge of subordinates who would otherwise have remained loyal. A prince who appeared poor invited the assessment of enemies that he lacked the resources to resist them. A prince who allowed others to see his doubt, his fear, his internal struggle. That prince was already constructing his own downfall, stone by stone. In the private theatre of others' perception, every weakness made visible became a permission slip for the ambitions of those who had been waiting for exactly that permission. And Machiavelli asked the question that so few are willing to ask, because answering it requires a degree of honesty about the world that most people find deeply uncomfortable. What would happen if a man understood this mechanism completely? Not theoretically, not as an interesting intellectual exercise, but understood it in the way a craftsman understands his tools, with the practical intimacy of someone who intends to use the knowledge precisely and daily. What would happen if, instead of waiting and hoping that the world would eventually look past appearances and judge him fairly, this man took complete control of what the world saw? The answer is the central thesis of everything you are about to hear and everything you are about to become. The man who masters his own image becomes, in a very real and very consequential sense, the author of his own fate. He does not wait for the world to assign him value. He assigns himself value, and the world, which is far more responsive to signal than to substance, accepts it with remarkable compliance. This is not a small idea to be absorbed in an afternoon and then set aside. This is not a technique you apply strategically once or twice and then forget. This is a total reorientation of how you move through your existence, Because right now, if you are genuinely honest with yourself, you are probably giving the world far too much unfiltered access to your internal state. You are projecting uncertainty when you are unsure. You are projecting scarcity when you are under financial pressure. You are projecting desperation when you need something you do not yet have. You are projecting apology when you should be projecting authority. And every time you do this, every time you allow the internal weather to become the external climate, you are handing the world a weapon it will use against you with complete impartiality and absolute consistency. Not because people are evil, not because the world has made a decision to work against you personally, but because the social world operates entirely on signal and response. When you signal weakness, the response is diminishment. When you signal strength, the response is respect. The signal is in your hands, it always has been. And that realization, genuinely absorbed, genuinely accepted, changes everything. Continue watching, because what comes next will not only show you the theory, but will trace the exact mechanism through which perception moves through social systems and translates into opportunity or the absence of it. And it will show you how to take control of what the world sees when it looks in your direction. There is a word that Machiavelli used with surgical precision throughout his writing, a word that has been translated and debated and misunderstood across centuries: fortuna. Fortune. He did not use it the way most people do, as a synonym for luck, for random chance, for the unpredictable and uncontrollable winds of fate that simply arrive and depart without regard for human intention. He used it to describe something more specific and considerably more frightening: the portion of your life that you have surrendered to external forces, the portion you have refused to govern, or more often, the portion you never realized you could govern. And his central warning, the one that runs like a live current through every page of The Prince and every letter he wrote, was this: the man who surrenders too much to Fortuna will be destroyed by it. Not because Fortuna is malicious, but because Fortuna, like every force in the natural world, does not distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving. It does not reward patience or punish arrogance. It simply flows toward the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance is always, without exception, the man who appears weak. Think carefully about how the social ecosystem actually functions at every level you inhabit: professional, personal, financial, relational. It is not, despite what you were told with such conviction in your most formative years, a meritocracy. It is not a system built to identify and reward the most capable, the most hard-working, the most virtuous, or the most deserving. The social ecosystem is a system that rewards the most credible. And credibility, this is the point that requires the deepest absorption, is not about truth. Credibility is about what people believe, and what people believe is shaped not by careful evaluation of evidence, not by the rational assessment of demonstrated competence, but by appearance, by the signals you emit, by the image you project into every space you enter, in every interaction you have with every person you encounter. This is the mechanism that Machiavelli mapped centuries before modern psychology gave it a name, or modern economics quantified its effects. He called it the appearance of virtue being more important than virtue itself, not because virtue was worthless or irrelevant, but because a man who was genuinely virtuous but appeared uncertain, diminished or weak, would be treated as though he had no virtue at all. While a man who appeared strong and capable, even if his interior was complicated, even if he had doubts and flaws and failures that would embarrass him if made public, would be treated as though his strength were absolute and his judgment beyond question. This is a genuinely difficult truth to absorb if you have been raised, as most people have, to believe that authenticity is always rewarded, that honesty about your struggles will invite compassion and support, that showing vulnerability will create connection and trust. And in certain contexts, in deep friendships, in intimate relationships, in spaces of genuinely established mutual safety, these things are partially true. But in the social arena, in the professional world, in the broader theater of public life where most of the decisions that determine your trajectory are made, vulnerability without power is not strength. It is an invitation, an open invitation for others to perceive you as someone whose terms are negotiable, whose standards are flexible, whose position can be managed rather than respected. The cold, uncomfortable, and ultimately liberating reality of Machiavellian logic is this. In the domains where your future is constructed, you can project vulnerability or you can project power. You cannot afford to project both simultaneously, especially before you have established the kind of unquestioned authority that makes vulnerability a luxury rather than a liability. Let us examine this not in historical courts, but in the environments you navigate every day. Consider the job interview, a microcosm of social negotiation that reveals the mechanism in its clearest form. You walk in needing this position. The financial pressure you are under is real. It is heavy and it is constant. It is not imaginary. And because it is so real and so present, it leaks. It leaks in the slight forward lean of eagerness that reads as desperation. It leaks in the speed of your answers, that particular anxiety that compels you to fill every pause, to preempt every silence, to demonstrate your worth before the question has fully landed. It leaks in the way you respond to even mild objections with an immediate softening of your position, an offer to accept conditions below what you deserve, a visible gratitude that signals relief rather than confidence. And the interviewer, who is themselves a human animal reading social signals the way every social creature learns to, receives all of this information simultaneously. They do not process it consciously and analytically, they simply feel it. And what they feel underneath the polished surface of the conversation is this: this person needs us more than we need them. The moment that calculation settles, and it settles quickly without drama like a key turning in a lock, your negotiating position collapses entirely. Your perceived value drops. The very sincerity and urgency of your need, which you perhaps imagined would communicate commitment and motivation, has become the primary argument for offering you less. This plays out identically in every domain of negotiation across the full spectrum of human life. In business transactions, in romantic partnerships, in the quiet hierarchy of every social gathering, every professional community, every network of human beings who are, whether they admit it or not, whether they are conscious of it or not, continuously evaluating each other and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The person who appears to need nothing gets offered everything. The person who appears to need something is offered terms that reflect their apparent neediness. This is not justice, but it is physics. It is the social gravity of the perception of abundance versus the social gravity of the perception of scarcity. And Machiavelli's counsel, insofar as 5 centuries of translated text can be distilled into a single actionable directive, was not to rage against this gravity. His counsel was to understand it with such precision and depth that you could navigate it and ultimately use it. Now consider what it actually means in practical terms to appear to need nothing. It does not mean to actually need nothing. Every human being has needs. Every person you have ever admired, every figure of genuine power and commanding presence you have ever encountered, carries needs, fears, doubts, and pressures that are often far heavier than they appear. The difference between that person and the person who is consistently underestimated, undervalued, and undertreated is not the presence or absence of these internal experiences. The difference is the discipline, the deliberate, practiced, and eventually internalized discipline of not allowing those internal experiences to determine what the world sees. The person who has mastered this appears, at all times and in all circumstances, as though their life is fundamentally under their own command, as though the outcome of this particular negotiation, this particular meeting, this particular social interaction is important and real, but not essential, as though they could walk away, as though they are not diminished by the prospect of not obtaining what they want, because their sense of value is not contingent on obtaining it. This posture, this performance of abundance, of options, of interior freedom, is not dishonesty. It is the highest form of strategic intelligence available to a social animal. Because what it communicates is not a lie, it communicates the deeper truth of who you are in the process of becoming. A person whose identity is self-generated rather than other-granted. A person whose value lives inside them, not in the possession of others' approval. There are specific, observable, and entirely correctable signals that the world reads as poverty, not financial poverty exclusively, but the poverty of presence, of authority, of self-possession, of social value. The first signal is desperation, which we have already discussed. The second is excessive explanation, the compulsive need to justify your decisions, your positions, your requests, as though you require permission to inhabit your own stance. The third is apologetic positioning, the reflex of minimizing yourself before others have given any indication that you need to, preemptively reducing your own claim on the space to forestall rejection. The fourth is visible social anxiety, the nervous energy that bleeds into your physical presentation in rooms where you feel the stakes are high and which tells every person in that room that you are not certain you belong there. The fifth, perhaps the most quietly damaging of all, is the inconsistency between how you speak about yourself and how you actually carry yourself, the gap between the story you tell and the signal you emit, which creates a dissonance that others detect immediately and which undermines every claim you make about your own value. Each of these signals, when consistently detected, recalibrates the behavior of everyone in your social environment. Each of them is correctable, not through performance, not through the exhausting maintenance of a persona, but through the methodical construction of a genuinely different relationship with your own worth, a relationship in which your value is not dependent on external validation and therefore does not leak into your external presentation like water through a cracked vessel. The vessel must be sealed from the inside, and that sealing begins with understanding, continues through practice, and completes in the transformation of identity itself. Now we move into territory that demands real courage to examine honestly, because everything discussed until this point has been about the external world, about how others read the signals you emit, about how social systems process appearance, about the Machiavellian logic of perception operating across every dimension of human interaction. But the source of the signal is never external. It is always internal. And if you genuinely want to change what you project, you must first develop an unflinching understanding of what creates the projection. The appearance of poverty, of weakness, of need, of diminishment, almost never begins with external circumstances. It begins with a decision you made at some point in your life about what you were worth, not a conscious decision, not something you deliberated over with full awareness and then wrote down and committed to, but a slow accumulation of moments in which the world provided you with information about your place in its hierarchy, and you accepted that information as permanent truth about yourself. A teacher who dismissed your idea in front of others, a parent who rewarded your compliance and punished your independence, a relationship in which your needs were consistently treated as inconvenient, as excessive, as less important than someone else's preferences, a professional environment in which you observed less capable people advance while you were overlooked, generating in you the quiet, poisonous belief that the system was assessing something in you specifically and finding it wanting. Each of these moments left a residue, a deposit in the account of your self-perception. And over time, if those deposits went unchallenged, if no counterforce arrived to dispute their authority, they formed a structure, an internal architecture that does not announce itself in words, but governs behavior in 1,000 micro-decisions every day. An architecture that tells you, below the level of conscious thought, that you are someone who receives rather than someone who commands, someone who waits for permission rather than someone who acts on authority, someone who hopes the world will be generous rather than someone who determines what the world provides. Machiavelli would have recognized this pattern immediately because he observed it in the political leaders of his time with the clarity of a diagnostician who has seen the disease many times before. He wrote about princes who were defeated not on the battlefield but in their own council chambers, by advisors who detected the tremor of uncertainty beneath the prince's decisions and moved to exploit it, by subordinates who sensed that the authority above them was performed rather than genuine and began quietly constructing their own power accordingly, by enemies who read the defensive quality of the prince's maneuvers and understood that they were dealing not with a sovereign, but with someone managing his position from a place of internal insecurity. The external defeat always followed the internal one, and the internal defeat always looked the same: a man who had stopped believing in the legitimacy of his own authority, who had begun to manage his position reactively rather than shaping it proactively, who had traded the posture of the creator for the posture of the preserver, trying to maintain rather than to build, to survive rather than to dominate, to protect what he had rather than to expand what was possible. Modern psychology has given this pattern a name that Machiavelli would have found grimly amusing: learned helplessness. The phenomenon in which an organism, exposed repeatedly to circumstances beyond its control, stops attempting to exercise control even when the capability to do so has been restored. The organism has learned, through experience, through repeated disappointment, that its actions do not reliably produce desired outcomes, and so it stops acting. It accommodates. It adjusts its expectations downward to match the diminished returns its actions have historically produced. This is not weakness of character. It is not stupidity. It is the rational response of an intelligent system to the data it has collected. But the data, in most cases, is old. The experiences that generated the pattern of learned helplessness are historical. The authority they were granted to govern present behavior was never legitimately assigned. It was simply never revoked. And revoking it is the beginning of everything. There is a concept that complements this one, which psychologists call self-handicapping. It describes the behavior of individuals who, anticipating failure, unconsciously create conditions that explain the failure before it occurs. They underprepare for important presentations and then attribute the weak result to insufficient time rather than insufficient belief in their own value. They procrastinate on significant projects until the compressed timeline justifies a result that falls short of their actual capability. They minimize their stated ambitions in public, announcing modest goals so that if they fall short, the gap between ambition and achievement is not humiliating. They preemptively position themselves below their actual aspiration so that arriving there does not feel like failure. This behavior feels protective. It feels in the moment like the sensible management of emotional risk. But what it actually does, with reliable, almost mechanical consistency, is ensure the outcome it fears. Because the social world detects self-handicapping with extraordinary accuracy, it reads the behavior not as humility or wisdom, but as confession, as the involuntary public disclosure of private doubt, and it responds to that disclosure by providing exactly what the self-handicapper has prepared for: reduced trust, diminished opportunity, lower stakes, and the quiet confirmation that this person's assessment of their own potential is approximately correct. Your internal narrative, the story you carry about yourself, your capabilities, your deserving, your place in every hierarchy you inhabit, is not invisible. It is not safely contained behind the walls of your psychology, inaccessible to the social world around you. It broadcasts itself through every dimension of your external presentation, through the pace and volume of your speech, through the directness or evasiveness of your eye contact, through the firmness of your decisions or the trail of qualifications that follow them, through whether you claim physical and conversational space or minimize your presence in it, through whether you enter environments as someone who belongs or as someone who hopes to be accommodated, through 1,000 signals, large and small, consistent and cumulative, that together form the image the world has of you. The gap between who you believe yourself to be and who you present yourself as to the world is, across time, always approaching zero. The mask and the face eventually become the same thing, not because performance is dishonest, but because performed behavior maintained consistently restructures the performer. Which means the most powerful investment you can make, more powerful than any skill acquisition, any credential, any network cultivation, is the complete reconstruction of your internal valuation of yourself. The investment in the foundation beneath the performance, so that the performance eventually ceases to be performance at all. This is what Machiavelli meant when he invoked the concept of virtue. Not virtue in the passive moral sense of avoiding wrongdoing, but the active, sovereign force of a person who has claimed their own agency so completely that their will becomes a kind of gravity that shapes the environment around them. The person of virtue does not react to circumstances. They do not manage conditions. They do not wait to see what the world will offer, and then decide whether to accept. They create conditions. They shape the environment before the environment shapes them. They walk into situations already having determined what they intend to produce from them. And this capacity, this generative authorial relationship with the world, begins not in strategy and not in technique, but in the absolute permanent refusal to accept a diminished self-concept as legitimate truth. The person of virtue does not negotiate with the internal voice that tells them they are not enough. They do not acknowledge its authority. They treat it the way a sovereign treats a usurper, with the decisive, non-dramatic clarity that there is only one authority here, and that authority is their own. This is the foundation. Before any technique, before any tactic of projection or presentation, before any discussion of how to move through rooms, how to conduct negotiations, how to manage silence, how to project composure in high-stakes situations. Before all of that, this must be genuinely understood and authentically accepted. The world will not value you more than you value yourself. It cannot, because the signal you send originates in your relationship with your own worth, and the response the world provides corresponds to the signal it receives. Strengthen the foundation, and the signals change. Not immediately, not without effort, not without the discomfort of practicing new behaviors before they become natural. But they change, and the change compounds. Here is where the philosophy becomes architecture, and the architecture becomes action. You have understood the mechanism of perception. You have been invited to confront the internal source of the signal you project. Now it is time to speak with precision about what it looks like, tactically, behaviorally, and practically, to project the image of a person who operates from a position of genuine authority over their own life. The image that Machiavelli identified as essential to survival, to advancement, and to the accumulation of influence in any environment where other human beings must be navigated. The first domain is physical presence, and it deserves to be understood in a way that separates it completely from vanity or superficiality. Physical presence is not about aesthetics for their own sake. It is not about expensive clothing or physical attractiveness in the conventional sense. It is about the way you inhabit space as a form of communication. Every element of how you physically occupy the world around you carries information. Your posture communicates your relationship with authority. The pace of your movements communicates your relationship with pressure. The quality of your stillness when you are not moving communicates your relationship with your own interiority. The person who collapses inward, who rounds their shoulders reflexively, who minimizes their physical footprint in any space they enter, whose voice drops at the end of sentences as though seeking permission for what they have just said, is performing submission. Not intentionally. The performance is rarely conscious, but it is received with perfect accuracy by everyone who encounters it. Compare this with absolute clarity to the person who occupies space with deliberate ease, who sits as though they selected the chair rather than accepting it, who moves without urgency that reads as anxiety, who speaks at a pace that does not seek permission, a pace that communicates that what is being said has already been considered and found worth the time of the listener. Every particle of their physical presence says the same thing in the same language. I belong here. And belonging, that unspoken, non-argued legitimacy in any given environment, is the foundational signal of perceived authority. You cannot manufacture it through decoration, but you can practice the physical disciplines that produce it until those disciplines become your default orientation to the world. The second domain is what might be called economy of need. It is perhaps the most counterintuitive principle in the entire architecture of power, because it runs directly against one of the most fundamental human instincts. When you need something, the instinct is to communicate that need, to make it visible, to hope that visibility generates sympathy or urgency or cooperative response. This instinct is almost always strategically destructive in the social arena. Displaying need rarely generates what you hope it will generate. In the professional world, in financial negotiations, in social hierarchies, displayed need generates one of two things: exploitation by those who have what you need and recognize their leverage, or pity from those who do not. Neither of these outcomes serves your position. The Machiavellian alternative is discipline. The discipline of holding your need within yourself while presenting to the world the posture of a person who has options, who is genuinely interested in this particular opportunity but is not desperate for it, who could walk away, who is assessing the situation rather than auditioning for it. The same person, the same need, the same situation, entirely different signal, entirely different response. The third domain is selectivity, and this is the signal that most people underestimate most severely. What you refuse reveals your value more clearly than what you accept. The person who says yes to everything, who is perpetually available, who accommodates every request and adjusts their position to fit every preference, that person has announced, through the pattern of their accommodation, a scarcity of self-respect that others read as permission. They become the person who can be asked for anything, whose time and energy are resources others feel entitled to draw upon without reciprocation, whose opinions can be safely ignored because they will not push back in any way that carries consequence. Machiavelli understood the political grammar of refusal. A prince who declined certain requests was not perceived as obstructive. He was perceived as sovereign. His refusals were evidence of hierarchy, clear and legible evidence that his approval was not guaranteed, that his cooperation had genuine value, that his attention was a resource with real limits. Your refusals function with identical social mechanics. When you decline something, calmly, without apology, without the defensive over-explanation that reads as guilt, you announce the existence of standards, that your resources are finite and therefore precious, that you are not governed by the expectations of others. This is not rudeness, it is the precise calibration of social value. The fourth domain is your relationship with silence, and this requires genuine examination, because most people have a profoundly dysfunctional relationship with silence in social contexts. The silence between their last word and someone else's response. The silence that follows an offer or a proposal or a boundary. The silence that occurs when they have made a point and must allow it to simply exist in the room without embellishment. In that silence, most people collapse. They fill it immediately. They qualify the statement they just made. They soften the position they just took before they have received any indication that it will be resisted. They retreat from their own words before anyone has asked them to, and what this fills every silence behavior communicates is identical every time. I am not comfortable with what I just said. I am seeking reassurance. I am uncertain whether what I said was acceptable. Now, is it acceptable? This is the posture of someone who needs the room's validation. And the room, which reads this need instantly and accurately, responds with exactly the diminishment that the behavior advertises. The Machiavellian relationship with silence is entirely different. Silence, for the person of genuine self-possession, is not a void to be filled. It is a statement. It is the space in which the words just spoken are allowed to settle and carry their full weight without being undermined by the speaker. It communicates. I have said what I intended to say. I do not need to manage your reaction to it. I will wait here without discomfort for whatever comes next. The fifth domain is consistency, perhaps the least celebrated and most powerful of all the signals of authority. Insecurity reveals itself most reliably in inconsistency, in the way a person's energy and demeanor shift when they encounter someone they perceive as more powerful or more important than themselves, in the way they become smaller in the presence of authority and larger in the presence of those they perceive as beneath them, in the way they reserve their most commanding version of themselves for high-stakes interactions and allow the real signal, the anxious seeking signal, to govern everyday exchanges where they have decided the stakes are low. Machiavelli knew that reputation is built not in grand dramatic moments of obvious consequence, but in the accumulation of consistent daily behavior across every context. The prince whose standard of behavior was identical whether he was observed or unobserved, whether the stakes were enormous or negligible, whether he was engaging with allies or with adversaries, that prince built a reputation so dense and reliable that it began to operate as a force independent of any single interaction. He did not need to prove himself in each encounter because the history of his consistency had already made the proof. This is the compounding of identity over time, and it is available to anyone willing to apply the same standard in the small moments that no one appears to be watching. These 5 domains, physical presence, economy of need, selectivity, silence, and consistency, are not separate techniques to be applied independently. They are 5 dimensions of a single posture, the posture of a person who has made a fundamental decision about their own authority and expresses that decision through every channel available to them simultaneously. When all 5 are active together, the signal they produce is not subtle, it is unmistakable. And the response it generates, from colleagues, from strangers, from potential partners, from everyone who enters your orbit, is the response that has been waiting for the right signal all along. Let us now discuss the scenarios you actually inhabit, the rooms and conversations and negotiations where these principles are tested and either confirmed or abandoned. Because theory untethered from specific application is not strategic intelligence. It is philosophy for comfort. And comfort is not what we are building here. Consider the professional negotiation, the raise discussion, the contract term, the scope of a new project. These moments, which most people enter with a subtle but legible undercurrent of anxiety, are precisely the moments where everything we have discussed becomes either tool or liability. The person who enters a salary negotiation, having already mentally accepted a number lower than the one they will request, who has already constructed the concession in their mind before the counterparty has even responded, has already lost. Not because they lacked the ability to negotiate from strength, but because they signaled, in the quality of their preparation and the energy of their entrance, that they anticipated needing to concede. The signal creates the outcome it anticipates. This is not mysticism. It is the mechanics of social interaction. The person across the table reads your signal and calibrates their response accordingly. They push where they detect softness. They hold firm where they detect conviction. They offer less where they sense you will accept less. And they often do all of this without any conscious awareness that they are doing it. They are simply responding, as all social organisms do, to the signal. The counter-approach does not require aggressiveness. It does not require performance or bluster or manufactured confidence that you do not actually feel. It requires only the practice of entering the negotiation, having genuinely done the work of knowing your value. Not your hoped-for value, not your minimum acceptable value, your actual, defensible, market-accurate value, and then presenting that value in the calm, unhurried, non-apologetic way of someone who has already considered the question and arrived at an answer they are comfortable with. When the counterparty pushes back, you do not collapse. You acknowledge the push without absorbing it as a wound. I understand your position. My position is this. The sentence is simple. The simplicity is the power. Because the person who can state their position simply and then wait, without filling the subsequent silence, without rushing to resolve the tension, is the person who controls the pace and therefore the outcome of the exchange. Consider the social scenario, the gathering of people you do not know well, the networking event, the party where you arrive without the safety net of an established relationship. Most people in these environments orient themselves toward the goal of being accepted, of finding someone who will receive them, who will signal approval, who will make them feel that their presence is welcome. This orientation, even when it is managed skillfully, produces a subtle energy that others detect immediately. The energy of someone who is there to receive validation rather than to contribute presence. And people instinctively orient away from that energy, not out of cruelty, but out of the social animal's preference for engaging with people who appear to already have what they are looking for. The alternative orientation is to enter the room already comfortable in yourself, to move through the environment with the genuine curiosity of someone who finds the people around them interesting rather than necessary, to initiate conversations not out of the anxiety of needing connection, but out of the genuine interest of someone who has enough that they can afford to give attention freely. This shift from seeking to offering, from needing to contributing, produces a completely different presence, and that presence attracts reliably and without manipulation the kind of engagement that the seeking orientation could never generate. Consider the scenario of public criticism. The moment when someone challenges your idea, your judgment, or your work in front of others. This is perhaps the most revealing test of the posture we have been building, because it is the moment when the two possible internal architectures diverge most visibly. The person whose self-valuation is contingent on others' approval experiences criticism as a threat to their fundamental sense of worth. And because it is experienced as a threat to worth, it is responded to defensively, either with the excessive explanation that reads as wounded self-justification or with the angry counterattack that reads as proof of the wound. Both responses confirm the worst of what the critic intended. Both reveal that the target's sense of self has been successfully penetrated. The alternative, the response of genuine self-possession, is qualitatively different and requires a different internal architecture to produce. It is the response of someone who hears the criticism, evaluates it on its actual merits without the distortion of wounded ego, and responds from a position of existing stability rather than reactively from a position of felt threat. Sometimes this means acknowledging the validity of the criticism, doing so calmly, without theatrical self-deprecation, and then moving forward. Sometimes it means disagreeing, doing so clearly, without belligerence, from the simple authority of a different but equally considered position. In neither case is the self diminished by the exchange. In both cases, the response itself teaches the room something about who they are dealing with. The errors to avoid in all of these scenarios share a common root. They are all variations of the same fundamental mistake, subordinating your signal to your anxiety, allowing the fear of not being accepted, not being valued, not being approved to govern what you project. Every time you explain when you should simply state, every time you apologize when no wrong has been done, every time you accept a term you know is beneath you because the discomfort of declining feels too costly in the moment, every time you speak faster when you should speak more slowly, every time you fill a silence you should allow to stand. These are not small failures. They are cumulative signals that construct, over time, the image of a person who does not believe they have the right to occupy the space they are in. And that image, once established, requires significant, sustained, and deliberate effort to revise. The revision is not impossible. The transformation is accessible. But it requires the willingness to sit with the specific discomfort of doing things differently before differently has become familiar. The willingness to pause before responding, even when everything in you wants to rush to fill the space. The willingness to state your position simply and then wait, even when the silence that follows feels unbearable. The willingness to decline even when accepting would be easier. The willingness to occupy space fully, even when every habituated instinct tells you to minimize. This willingness, practiced consistently across the small moments and the large, is how the posture is built. One deliberate choice at a time until the deliberate becomes the automatic, and the automatic becomes the identity. Now we need to examine the dimension of this that involves money directly. Not because financial wealth is the totality of power or value, but because money is the most legible, most universally processed signal in the entire language of social credibility, and to avoid examining its role honestly would be a failure of exactly the kind of intellectual honesty that everything we have discussed demands. Machiavelli was explicit about the relationship between resources and political power in ways that made his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable, and that continue to make modern readers uncomfortable today. He understood that the appearance of resources, the credible projection of financial capacity, was not separate from political authority. It was one of its primary instruments. A prince who appeared wealthy could negotiate alliances from a position of perceived reliability. He could inspire loyalty from subordinates who believed their investment in him would generate returns. He could deter enemies who calculated that challenging him would be costly, and he could command the respect of those who would otherwise take him less seriously. A prince who appeared poor, regardless of what he actually possessed in coffers or in kind, invited the challenges of those who saw diminished cost in opposition and reduced confidence in alliance. In the modern social ecosystem, this mechanism operates with identical force and considerably less grace than in Machiavelli's courts. The financial signal you project is processed continuously and automatically in every environment you inhabit. It shapes the seriousness with which your ideas are received in professional meetings. It shapes the terms you are offered in business negotiations. It shapes the quality of the professional networks that choose to include or exclude you. It shapes, in ways that are rarely spoken about directly but are universally experienced, the promptness with which people return your communications, the enthusiasm with which they refer opportunities in your direction, the degree of consideration they apply to your requests. This is not a conspiracy of the wealthy against everyone else. It is simply the way social organisms process information about the reliability, capability, and access of the individuals within their networks. And while the inequity of this mechanism deserves critique, and the critique is legitimate, the critique does not change the mechanism. The mechanism operates whether you approve of it or not, whether you understand it or not. Understanding it and navigating it with intelligence rather than resentment is not surrender to injustice. It is the prerequisite for changing your position within the system while the broader system slowly changes. Here is what Machiavelli would counsel a person of currently limited financial means who has understood that perception is power. You do not need to be wealthy. What you need, urgently and specifically, is to stop projecting poverty. These are not the same imperative. Projecting poverty is not about the actual size of your financial position. It is about specific, identifiable behaviors and habits that signal scarcity, desperation, or an absence of standards. Complaining about money in public or semi-public contexts. Making your financial constraints the framing context in which you present yourself or your work. Accepting obviously inadequate terms in negotiations because you cannot afford the discomfort of maintaining your position. Cultivating a public posture of disdain for financial success as a psychological defense against the pain of not having it. Performing moral superiority to limitation as a substitute for actually addressing the limitation. These behaviors cost you in professional credibility, social value, and the quality of opportunities that flow in your direction, far more than the actual limitation they describe and express. The limitation itself is temporary and addressable. The signal, once established in the minds of those around you, is extraordinarily difficult to revise. The counter-strategy is not performance of wealth you do not have. It is the discipline of refusing to allow your constraints to define your projection. The discipline of negotiating from your value rather than from your need. Of investing whereas in the elements of your life that are visible, that others encounter and use to construct their image of you, at the level of the person you intend to become rather than the level you currently occupy. This is not recklessness, it is strategic resource allocation. The man who understands that his projection is his most valuable asset will prioritize that projection with the seriousness of an investor who understands which assets compound over time and which depreciate. The quality of his visible environment, the precision of his communication, the standard of his time and attention, these are assets that signal value, and the signal of value generates more value. This is the compounding of credibility, and it is the most immediately accessible form of wealth available to anyone at any starting point who has understood the mechanism. There is a behavioral economics phenomenon that Machiavelli would have recognized instantly: price-quality inference. People are extraordinarily poor at independently assessing intrinsic value. They are extraordinarily skilled at reading price signals and inferring quality from them. The consultant who charges significantly above market rate is often trusted more than one who charges below market, not because the work is necessarily superior, but because the price signal communicates a self-assessment that influences the client's assessment. The pricing of yourself, in salary negotiations, in the terms you accept, in the value you claim for your time and work, functions as a signal that your clients, your employers, your colleagues, and your social circle use to calibrate their valuation of you. The person who prices themselves low confirms, for everyone around them, that low is the appropriate assessment. The person who prices themselves at the level of who they intend to become begins the process of becoming it. Not because they have deceived anyone, but because the signal invites the treatment, and the treatment shapes the reality. We are now at the layer where everything becomes internal and everything becomes permanent, because the tactics of projection, the disciplines of presence, the Machiavellian architecture of appearing powerful, all of these can be practiced and improved and refined. But the person who practices them without having done the deeper work of actually reconstructing their self-perception will always be vulnerable, always on the edge of exposure, always one high-pressure moment away from the old signal leaking back through the new performance. The tactics are the expression of something. They are not the thing itself. And the thing itself is the decision, the final, complete, irrevocable decision about who you are in relationship to the world. Consider what it would mean to make this decision at the level of actual belief rather than intellectual agreement. Not to agree that you have value, that is easy. Not to understand that the mechanism rewards strong signals, that is merely comprehension. But to genuinely, from the root of your self-conception, believe that you are the source of your own authority, that your value is not assigned to you by employers, partners, social hierarchies, financial metrics, or the judgments of others. That it is generated internally is non-negotiable and is expressed rather than proven. This belief, which sounds simple when stated and is genuinely transformative when embodied, changes everything it touches, not through magic, through the mechanics of signal, because when the belief is genuine, the signal is clean. When the signal is clean, the response changes. And when the response changes, the external reality begins to reorganize itself around the new signal. Not immediately, not without friction, but with the inevitability of any system adjusting to a new input over time. The period of friction, the time between beginning to change your signal and seeing the world's response change accordingly, is where most people abandon the transformation, because the period of friction is disorienting. The old responses continue for a while, even after the new signal has begun. The people around you who are accustomed to your previous projection continue to respond to it, because they have not yet fully registered that it has changed. And this creates a moment in which the new behavior feels unsupported, in which the new posture feels like a claim that no one is yet endorsing, in which it is tempting to conclude that the change is not working and retreat to the familiar. This moment, this specific window of apparent discrepancy between the new behavior and the unchanged response, is the critical test of whether the transformation is real or merely aspirational. The person who holds their new signal through this period, who maintains the new disciplines without external validation, who refuses to collapse back into the old projection because the world has not yet caught up, that person is the one who gets through to the other side where the world has recalibrated, where the new signal is the established signal, where the response has changed because the input is consistently different. Machiavelli wrote, near the end of his life, about the importance of the prince being seen as reliable in his dispositions, not flexible, not adaptable to the mood of the moment, not calibrated to whatever the current political climate required. Reliable, consistently himself, not because rigidity was always strategically optimal, but because the perception of reliability, the sense that this person will be the same tomorrow as they are today, that their standard does not fluctuate with circumstance, was the foundation of all lasting trust. And trust, in Machiavelli's reckoning, was the only currency that could not be counterfeited and could not be devalued by external events. A prince whose word meant exactly what it said, whose standards did not bend under pressure, whose presence in any room carried the same quality regardless of what was at stake. That prince did not need to prove himself in each individual encounter, because the cumulative history of his consistency had already made the proof. He arrived having already been established. And that establishment is the most powerful position available to any person navigating the social world. This is what you are building, not a performance, not a strategy that requires constant conscious management, but an identity, a complete and settled sense of who you are in the world that generates the right signal automatically, that projects authority without effort, that invites the treatment you deserve without requiring you to argue for it in every encounter. This is the identity on the other side of the transformation, and you are closer to it than you think if you are willing to do what is required. And so we reach the place where all rivers converge, the place where philosophy and strategy and psychology and the cold, centuries-old intelligence of Machiavelli arrive at a single point, the point of decision. Not the decision to try something new for a while and see if it works, not the decision to apply a set of techniques when the stakes feel high enough to justify the effort. The decision, complete, permanent, made from the deepest layer of your self-conception, about who you are and how you are going to inhabit your existence. This decision is not announced. It is not performed. It is not explained to anyone. It is felt for the first time as a settling, as the particular relief of something that has been in tension finally resolving. The relief of a person who has been holding themselves smaller than they actually are, finally allowing themselves to occupy their real dimensions. You already know the feeling. You have glimpsed it in moments of unexpected confidence, of unusual clarity, of the specific ease that comes when you are not managing anyone's perception of you and simply existing in your full presence. These moments have been real. They were not flukes. They were demonstrations of capacity. They were the signal operating without interference, showing you what is available when the habituated machinery of self-diminishment is briefly suspended. What this entire body of teaching has been building toward is the permanent suspension of that machinery, not through willpower alone, not through the gritted teeth performance of confidence that you do not feel, but through the genuine reconstruction of the internal architecture that generates the signal. You are not the person the world has treated you as when you appeared weak. You are not the assessment made in 3 seconds by someone who had already decided they were not going to look closely. You are not the terms you accepted in a negotiation where you did not believe in your own value. You are not the opportunities you did not pursue because the fear of rejection felt more certain than the possibility of success. You are not any of these things. They were signals of a story you were telling about yourself, a story that was never entirely accurate and that has long outlived whatever usefulness it might once have had. The story ends now, not dramatically, not with announcement, simply with the quiet internal recognition that you have finished receiving it as truth. What begins in its place is the story of someone who moves through the world with the unquestioned legitimacy of a person who belongs in it, who negotiates from value, who projects from abundance, who maintains standards with the simple dignity of someone for whom standards are not negotiable, who occupies space fully, speaks with precision, uses silence strategically, and meets the gaze of the world without flinching and without the need to perform. This person is not untouchable in the sense of being invulnerable to difficulty or loss or pain. They are untouchable in the specific Machiavellian sense, the sense that their sense of self is not available for extraction by the opinions or behaviors of others. Their identity is theirs. Their authority is self-generated. Their value is not dependent on anyone's continued confirmation, and because it is not dependent on that confirmation, it does not need to seek it, does not need to perform for it, does not need to be managed or protected or maintained through the exhausting vigilance of someone who is always afraid of being found out. Machiavelli's deepest insight, the one that lives beneath all the tactical advice, beneath all the political analysis, beneath all the observations about courts and princes and the nature of power, is this: the only freedom that cannot be taken is the freedom that comes from having genuinely claimed your own authority over your own life. External circumstances can constrain you. Opponents can limit your options. Fortune, as he acknowledged with the realism of a man who had experienced its cruelty personally, can strip away position and comfort and public standing. But the internal sovereignty of a person who has made the fundamental decision about who they are, that sovereignty is immune to fortune. It cannot be confiscated, it cannot be diminished by external verdict. And from that sovereignty, always, a new engagement with the world can begin. This is the paradox of the man who appears poor and the man who appears powerful. The paradox is that neither appearance is ultimately about what they have or do not have. Both appearances are about who they have decided to be. The man who appears poor has decided, consciously or not, that his value is contingent, negotiable and dependent on circumstances. The man who appears powerful has decided that his value is inherent, non-negotiable, and independent of circumstances. The external signals that flow from these two decisions are radically different, and the world they generate, the opportunities, the respect, the treatment, the quality of the relationships and environments they inhabit is radically different. Same world, different decision, entirely different life. If this has resonated with you, if something in what you have heard today has landed not just in your intellect, but in that deeper place where real recognition occurs, then leave a comment below with these words: "My presence speaks before I do." So this is not a comment, it is a declaration, a public permanent announcement that you have understood the law, accepted its terms, and chosen to stand on the right side of it. Not as performance, as commitment. And if you are ready to continue this, to build this one conversation at a time, one insight at a time, until the architecture of genuine authority is so thoroughly yours that it requires no maintenance, then subscribe to this channel, not because we will comfort you, but because we will, with consistency and without apology, give you the tools to stop being managed by a world that has never understood what you are actually worth. This is the Fortaleza, a place for people who have decided that the old signal is done, that the apology is over, that the audition has ended. Go now. And let your arrival answer every question before it is asked. Let your silence carry more weight than most people's arguments. Let your presence be the evidence that everyone who ever underestimated you did not see coming. Machiavelli knew. Now, so do you. Ta studio circular sadit by title. When you appear poor, everything conspires against you. Machiavelli was right language, English. Thinker Machiavelli. Blocks. 8. Style. Dark philosophy. Power psychology.